Okay, you guys, we're now going to look at the bonds chapter. I think the chapter is actually titled Bonds and Long-Term Notes. We're going to cover some of both. The long-term notes are fairly simple. The bonds are not that bad either, but they're the more complex of the two topics. So I thought we would go through a few topics related to bonds. Corporate bonds is really what we're talking about before we started the chapter. Now, when a corporation issues bonds, you guys, it's just another way they have of financing operations. They could do like you or I and just borrow money from a lending institution like a bank or a credit union. A lot of times, of course, a corporation couldn't borrow from a credit union, but a bank, any traditional lender. They could issue shares of stock originally, or they could issue additional shares if they've been authorized by the state they're incorporated in to do so. And a third way is to issue bonds, which is essentially just borrowing from the investing public. When the amounts are really large, a lot of times that's how it's handled because a bank may not want that much exposure. So, for instance, if a corporation needs to raise $1 billion, well, a bank probably wouldn't. I mean, maybe they would. It just depends. But a lot of banks might not want to loan a corporation $1 billion. But you could break those down into bonds, 1,000 each or something like that, and then sell them to the investing public and raise $1 billion that way. Now, when they sell bonds to the investing public, the bond purchaser does not own a part of the corporation. Instead, the corporation just owes them a debt plus interest. So, two obligations taken on by a corporation when it issues bonds. First, to repay the face amount at the end of the bond term. So, for instance, if a corporation does a $50 million bond issue for 20 years, at the end of that 20 years, they'd have to repay the bondholders $50 million. Now, over that 20-year period, they have to pay interest periodically. Usually that's done twice a year or semi-annually. Now, when a corporation decides they want to issue bonds, they'll draw up the paperwork for those one day. And on that day, they'll pick the market rate of interest for corporations that have the same credit rating they do. A corporation like you and I would have a credit rating, and the interest rate they would pay would be determined by that credit rating. So if a corporation wants to issue bonds, they say, okay, well, corporations issuing bonds today with our credit rating, they're paying 6%. So we'll go with 6%. And that's how the bonds get drawn up. Let's say to pay 6% interest annually, 3% every 6 months. Okay, but then there's some lapse time between the time the bonds are drawn up and when they're actually sold to the investing public or when they're issued. And interest rates they move on a daily basis, you guys. They move all the time. So that 6% rate that they used in the paperwork might not be the market rate on the day the bonds are issued. If it's not, then the bonds will sell at an amount greater than the face amount. I think our example was a $50 million bond issue. So those $50 million bonds could be sold to the investing public at exactly $50 million. They could be sold to the investing public at some amount greater or less than $50 million. You can know that just by looking at the interest rates associated with the bond issue before you ever do any calculations. So let's take a look at that part. You've got two interest rates associated with the bonds, and each of those have two names. I'm not sure why, maybe to just muddy the water. But first, the stated or contract rate is the rate of interest to be paid periodically by the issuer of the bonds to the bondholders. Generally, that's every 6 months. So that's the rate of interest that the issuing corporation is going to pay. In the example I was going through, they went with 6% on the day they drew them up. Then the market or effective rate is a rate of interest paid by other corporations with similar credit ratings to their bondholders on the day those bonds are issued. Okay, so what we have to do is compare the rate actually being paid by this corporation for the bond term to the market rate on the day those bonds are issued. The market rate for corporations with similar credit ratings. Okay, first off, if the stated rate or contract rate is equal to the market or effective rate, meaning they were drawn up at 6% and on the day they were issued, they're still at 6%, then the bonds will be issued at the face amount. If it's a $50 million bond issue, the issuing corporation would receive $50 million from the bond purchasers that day. Alright, that's not always the case, though. The two rates are not always going to be equal on the day the bonds are issued. If the stated or contract rate is greater than the market or effective rate on the day the bonds are issued, then the bonds will be issued at a premium. All right, let's think about this. The issuing corporation is paying a contract rate greater than the market rate for similar investments. So the investors or bond purchasers would be willing to pay more than the face amount for the bonds because they're going to receive greater than the market rate of interest over the bond term. The opposite situation would be if the contract rate is less than the market rate on the day the bonds are issued. That means other corporations are paying 8% when they have the same credit rating as us, and we're only paying 6%. Well, if that's the case, then no one would be willing to pay full price for these bonds, so they'd have to be issued at a discount. In our example, something less than $50 million. So when you're looking at a problem, you can compare these two rates. If the stated rate is higher than the market rate, then there'll be a premium. If the market rate is higher than the stated rate, then the bonds will be issued at a discount. Now you have to make some calculations to determine the amount of cash proceeds that the issuing corporation will receive on the day that the bonds are sold. There's 4 steps in that process to calculate cash proceeds from a bond issue. And they're given to you here. And we're going to refer back to these and work in some of the problems. But first, you want to take the present value of the face amount. In our example, I've been calling the face amount $50 million. It's just whatever the bond issue is for. Alright, so we calculate the present value of the face amount using the present value of $1 table on P-2 in the back of the book. To use a table, you'll need to determine the number of interest payment periods in the bond term. So if it was 20 years and we're paying interest twice a year, there would be 40 interest payment periods in that bond term. And then you'd also need to know the effective or market interest rate per interest payment period. So if the market rate was 8% for a year, it would be 4% every 6 months. Then you go to the table. You come, let's see, let me just open it up here. It's in the very back of your book. If you go to page P-2, that's the present value of $1 table. It's the way we determine the present value amount of a single sum to be received in the future. The repayment of the face amount qualifies as a single sum to be received in the future. In our case, it was 20 years from now, and we said the market rate was 8%. Okay, it's 8% for a year, so it's 4% for a half a year. So go to that page P-2, come across the top. It's in the very back of your book, Appendix P. Come across that top row until you see 4%. And then 20 years, interest payable twice a year, would be 40 interest payment periods. So come all the way down to the bottom, and you see 0.20829. All right, we'd multiply 50 million by that number, and that gives us the present value of the face amount. The next step, we want to calculate the amount of the individual semi-annual interest payments. Well, to do that, you just multiply the face amount by half of the contract or stated rate. Remember, the contract or stated rate's for a full year. So to get the amount of interest that the issuing corporation will pay every 6 months, you cut that stated or contract rate in half and multiply it by the face amount. I think in our example we said the contract rate was 6%. So that's 3% every 6 months times 50 million. And that would give you interest, let's just do this as we go. Well, we got 50 million here. Then we're going to multiply, on step 1, we'd multiply by our factor from the table on page P-2, present value of $1. Let's go up here, we said $50 million face amount. Alright, and we said the stated or contract rate 6%. The market or effective rate is equal to 8%. And then we've got a $50 million face amount. Alright, then in the bond term, 20-year bond term. And then that's all we'll need to make these calculations. Okay, so what we'll do is here on step 1, we'll take the 50 million. Let me just do this. And then we're going to multiply times half the market rate we're going to multiply by a factor from the table using half the market rate and the number of interest payment periods. So here we have, and that's given to you over here, but we'll say, what is that? That's 40 periods at half the market rate. The 8% is for a year, so it'd be 4% for a half year. Okay, so that number, and that's what we're going to multiply by. I'll put a X in here showing we're going to multiply by it. Now we've got to find that factor on our table present value of $1. Okay, now again that's on page P-2. Sorry, I stumbled a little bit there. I was trying to figure out how to word that exactly. What we did, you guys, is 40 interest payment periods in a 20-year bond term. The interest is payable semi-annually. I should put that here too. Interest payable semi-annually. Let's start back. This is step 1. We have a $50 million bond issue. That's called the face amount. The market or effective rate of interest is 8% on the day the bonds are issued. The stated or contract rate is 6% annually. It's a 20-year bond term and interest is payable semi-annually. Well, if interest is payable twice a year for 20 years, then that means 40 interest payment periods. And we'll use half the market or effective rate in these present value calculations. 8% for a year, 4% every 6 months. So let's go to page P-2 again. This is probably the 5th time I've directed you there, but let's actually use it this time. Let's come across the top to 4%, come down to 40 interest payment periods, 0.20829. 0.20829. Okay, and equals 50 million times 0.20829. So there you go. $50 million to be received 20 years from now, assuming an interest rate of 8% with interest payable every 6 months. It's only worth $10,414,500 today. So the reverse would also be true. If you invested this much today, with interest payable every 6 months at 4% every 6 months, and you didn't touch it, at the end of 20 years, you'd have $50 million. Okay, next we want to calculate the amount of the individual semi-annual interest payments by multiplying the face amount by half the stated rate. Okay, well, here's our face amount again. We're going to multiply by 1/2 the stated or contract rate. Okay, the stated or contract rate is 6% for a year, so 0.03. Okay, and when we multiply that out, we get semi-annual interest. So how much interest the issuing corporation will have to pay every 6 months on this $50 million. Can you imagine that? Every 6 months, this issuing corporation is having to pay $1.5 million in interest on this $50 million that they borrowed from the investing public. Now, we want to know the $1.5 million every 6 months for 20 years is not worth $1.5 million times 40, because you have to wait to get the money, right? That's why this $50 million 20 years from now is not worth $50 million today. So next, we want to calculate the present value of the interest payments. So we'll start with the interest payments. $1.5 million every 6 months. Okay, and then we're going to go to a different present value table. This one was present value of $1. That's for a single sum to be received in the future. Here we want to multiply by the present value of an ordinary annuity. That's on page P-4. An annuity is just equal cash payments over time, and that's what we have here. $1.5 million every 6 months for 20 years. So if you go to page P-4, you see the table that says present value of an ordinary annuity of $1. Again, come across to 4% and down to 40 periods. You get 19.79277. Okay. 19.79277. Alright, then we're going to multiply that out. Okay, and that is the present value of the interest payments. What is $1.5 million every 6 months for the next 20 years? How much is that actually worth in today's dollars? Well, if you said 1.5 million times 40, which is how many times we're actually going to receive it, then you get, oh, what do we have here? It's easier for me to see with a few commas in there. $60 million total, right, to be received over 20 years. But that's not worth $60 million today. I hope that makes sense. Since you have to wait to get the money, the theory is it could be invested right during that time, and you'd have more later on. So the present value of $1.5 million every 6 months for 20 years, the total of those interest payments is $60 million, but in today's dollars, that's actually only worth $29,689,155 to us today. Okay, now step 4 is really easy. Step 4, to get the cash proceeds from the bond issue, we're just going to add together the answers from 1 and 3. So 1 plus 3 is going to give us 4 down here. So we're going to copy this one. Didn't get the number. What was that? 10 million. Then we're going to add that to the present value of the interest payment. Okay, so what we're doing, you guys, is just adding these two together. And that's going to be $40,103,655. That's cash proceeds from the bond issue. I'll just say cash proceeds from the bond issue. That's how much cash the issuing corporation will receive on the day they issued the bonds. Now, it's $50 million of bonds, right? So you might be thinking, why are they only receiving $40,103,655 today? Well, you guys, they are paying, the issuing corporation is paying 6% on these bonds when the market rate for similar investments is 8%. So the investors would not be willing to pay full price for 6% bonds when they could just go out and pay full price for 8% bonds, right? For a corporation with the same credit rating. So the issuing corporation here, since they're paying a contractor stated rate that's less than the market rate on the day the bonds were issued, then they're not going to receive the full $50 million up front. It's kind of just a way of the market equaling out the rates, right? Making the actual rate 8%, since that's what the market rate was on the day they're issued. But you just go through those 4 steps to calculate it. We're going to work a few problems using that and look at some journal entries with it as well. Sorry, I'm afraid that was a little choppy, but maybe not too bad. Go back through it if you need to. But we're going to see it several times. You just take, here you're going to the table present value of $1. That's on page A-2. We found our 4% across the top, came down to 40 periods, and found the factor 0.20829. We multiplied it by 50 million, and that tells us that 50 million 20 years from now, assuming these interest rates, it's only worth 10 million and some change, I guess we could call it, today. Then we want to know how much interest are they going to pay every 6 months. Well, they're going to have to pay 1.5 million. We know that by multiplying the face amount by half the contract or stated rate. Then we want to know, what is this 1.5 million every 6 months for 20 years? How much is that worth today? Well, it totals to 60 million. But since we have to wait and receive it over 20 years, it's actually only worth 29,689,155 to us today. I might have said 29,000. That's 29,689,155 is what it's worth today. So what we do, you guys, we take the present value of the face amount plus the present value of the interest payments. We add those two together, and that's how much the bond purchasers will be willing to pay for these 50 million in bonds, and that's how much the issuing corporation will receive on the day the bonds are issued. Again, you'll see this in several exercises, but at least maybe that's a little lecture there to get you started. Thanks a lot.